Hello, I'm Doug Smith from Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative, and today I'm going to be briefly talking about the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines. Why are we here? Partial fulfillment of Senate Bill 1, signed into law March 11, 2019, stated that a school safety and security threat assessment team would be designated at each school of the district. Some of the members of the threat assessment team may include school administrators, school counselors, school resource officers, school-based mental health services providers, teachers, and other school personnel. Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines, originally known as the Virginia Student Threat Assessment Guidelines, were developed at the University of Virginia. Dr. Dewey Cornell developed the threat assessment guidelines that we'll be discussing briefly. He's a professor of education in the Carey School of Education at the University of Virginia, director of the University of Virginia Youth Violence Project, forensic clinical psychologist specializing in violent offenders. He studied youth violence for 30 plus years with over 200 publications in psychology and education. Dr. Cornell developed the Threat Assessment Guidelines in 2001 and published the original manual in 2006. We've used this manual until the new manual was released in November 2018. What is threat assessment? Threat assessment is a term that originated in law enforcement as a strategy to prevent violence to public figures and other persons who were being threatened by someone. Over time, the meaning of the term has evolved. Most importantly, threat assessment is no longer considered just an assessment, but also an intervention designed to prevent violence. Threat assessment for schools is different than other forms of threat assessment. The basic idea behind threat assessment is to help people in distress before violence occurs. Threat assessment is a straightforward process. First, we must be able to identify the threats and have a climate where students and others are willing to report threats. Second, we need a process in place to evaluate a threat and determine whether it is serious. Third, based on the results of our evaluation, we need an intervention to reduce the risk of violence. Fourth, we must be prepared to follow up and make sure our intervention is working. So it should be clear that when we say threat assessment, we really mean threat assessment and intervention. We can think of threat assessment as part of a comprehensive approach to violence prevention. At the school-wide level, sometimes called Tier 1, we have programs for all students ranging from the school's disciplinary system to programs like Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, or PBIS. We may have school-wide bullying prevention. At Tier 2, we might have short-term counseling, tutoring, and small group programs for students who are at risk for problem behavior that could lead to violence. At Tier 3, we have more intensive ongoing interventions. This might include placement in an alternative school, special education services, and ongoing mental health treatment. Often a threat assessment helps determine the level of services that a student needs. Many communities have overreacted to school shootings. There are two ways that the fear of school violence has had a negative impact on our schools. Security measures take resources away from other school programs. A school counselor could save more lives than a police officer in the school. What is a threat? We begin defining a threat. A threat is any expression of intent to harm someone. A threat can be spoken, written, emailed, or even gestured. A threat can be directed, such as "I'm going to get you," or indirect, such as "I've had it with him and I'm going to get him." A transient threat is a threat that is not a serious threat or a true threat. Threats that are rhetorical, jokes, or expressions of emotion can all be grouped together as transient threats. We call them all transient threats because they are temporary and easily resolved. A threat that can be easily and quickly resolved is by definition a transient threat. It usually ends with an apology or clarification. On the other hand, a threat that cannot be easily resolved and where you have some concern that the student might carry out the threat is classified as a substantive threat. These threats have substance. They are serious threats and in legal terms might be called true threats. The distinction between a transient threat and a substantive threat is important for one practical reason. If you think a threat is substantive, you must take some kind of protective action. This might mean notifying the intended victim, contacting the police, or taking some other action to keep the threat from being carried out. On the other hand, if a threat is transient, there is no need to take protective action. Substantive threats can range from a fight or assault to something much more severe, such as an aggravated assault or a homicide. Substantive threats are divided into two groups: serious substantive cases and very serious substantive cases. A serious substantive involves an assault or fight. A threat to shoot, stab, kill, or rape someone would be a very serious substantive case. So the distinction is one of severity, serious or very serious. Here is the decision tree. This is a triage process. In the beginning, we gather information to assess whether this is a simple case that can be easily resolved or is a more complex case that will take more time. However, we will not treat all cases the same. It is important to teach our students that there is a difference between snitching for personal gain and seeking help to stop someone from being hurt. This is a lesson that every teacher, counselor, administrator, and police officer should stress. A key point that we need to understand is we're not trying to determine whether a student made a threat, but whether a student poses a threat. Many students make threats for all sorts of reasons, but very few actually pose a threat. Keep in mind that just screaming or shouting at someone or cursing someone is not necessarily a threat. A threat occurs when a student expresses an intent to harm someone. We see this sometimes when a student is angry at a teacher or a classmate and screams something angry. An angry outburst is not necessarily a threat. A threat assessment is not undertaken as a disciplinary measure or a punishment for misbehavior. A threat assessment is only undertaken if there is concern that someone intends to commit a violent act. No matter the kind of threat a student makes, our primary goal is always to prevent violence. This takes precedence over discipline, over instruction, over any other goal. A key point is that a threat assessment is concerned with understanding why a student made a threat in order to understand how we can prevent a threat from being carried out. Threats are an attempt to solve a problem that we have not been able to solve in a more reasonable way. Every kid who makes a threat has encountered a problem that he or she cannot solve. Some kids are not very good problem solvers, and we as adults are better problem solvers. So that is why I say that threat assessment is a problem-solving approach to violence prevention. We're going to help the students solve a problem, and that will be the most effective way to resolve the threat and prevent violence too. One of the biggest barriers to effective threat assessment is communication. Agencies and offices do not share information because they are concerned with confidentiality and the privacy of student records. This is a common problem seen all over the country. School Safety Online Educational Program. These links will allow you access to the programs. Visit www.schoolthreatassessment.com where you can preview any of the programs using the preview codes below. These codes are meant only to be previews and are meant only to be used as reviews of the programs. For more information, please visit the youthviolence.edschool.virginia.edu. Thank you. To schedule a comprehensive school threat assessment guidelines training, please contact me, Doug Smith, at Doug.smith at hazard.kvischools.us or your local co-op consultants. Thank you and have a great evening.